Okay, welcome back, everyone. We have another special guest with us today to talk about debate. She's been on this channel before. This is Amadea Datel. And Amadea, you have won three college policy tournaments. Is that right?
Yep.
Pretty impressive. And also started your own LD program in high school. So we are incredibly blessed to have Amadea with us here today once again. And what's more, Amadea has her own YouTube channel. You should go subscribe. I'll link it down below in the description. So check it out. Okay, so I have a few questions for you about debate, and then we'll talk about the nuclear energy topic. First, can you just tell us what has your debate experience been like?
Sure. So first, thank you so much for having me. Glad to be on here again. In terms of my debate experience, I did high school LD and then I did college policy after that. So I started LD my sophomore year of high school, did mostly local LD because my school didn't really have a team. So I was going to tournaments with a few people from my school, also trying to establish a team in the meantime. I went to camp the summer after my sophomore year where I was exposed to the whole world of national circuit debate and convinced that I wanted to do it. Wasn't really able to do it in high school, only attended two national circuit tournaments because of some resource barriers. But then when COVID started my senior year, I started competing at all of these online tournaments, which is also why I'm a huge proponent of online debate. I believe it's great in bridging those accessibility barriers and letting people debate from anywhere for very low costs. And then after that, I was convinced that I wanted to continue debating, even though the college I'd committed to also didn't have a college policy program. And so I started doing college policy on my own. I was hybriding with people from different schools. And so I learned a lot about how different policy programs operated. Then I transferred to Dartmouth after my sophomore year, actually quit debate shortly after. But yeah, I don't know. It was a fun experience. I feel like I learned a lot from both LD and policy.
I have some questions about it seems like almost uniquely you've had a lot of barriers and challenges in the way of like competing, especially at the highest levels, but you've still been able to prevail and go to these tournaments and do very well at these tournaments. So I was wondering, do you have any advice for students who might be in similar situations who like don't have a lot of institutional support or don't have teams of their own? Like what helped you find the success that you did despite those things?
Yeah, so several things. So first, I would prioritize going to as many tournaments as you possibly can. I think that's the best way to learn debate. In fact, I think that's something that you were talking about when we were talking to some of the teachers that we work with in Fulbright. You were like, what's the point of learning all the rules of a game and then not actually playing that game? But I think playing the game over and over again by going to tournaments is very helpful. And not just going to the tournaments, but also getting down all the judges' feedback, doing rebuttal redos, changing your strategies based on that, and just taking the most out of you can out of every single tournament you go to. I think that's a lot easier to do now than when I was in high school, just because there are so many more online tournaments that you can go to. And if you can't afford them, you can always reach out to the tournament organizers, get a fee waiver for them. And so it makes debate so much more accessible. In terms of other ways you can learn debate, I think going to camp is also great because it connects you to a whole network of coaches and other debaters who will motivate you to improve throughout the season, and scheduling practice rounds with them, keeping in touch with other people you've met at camp and reaching out for advice can just be instrumental in getting better. So I would do that. I know that camp is a little more expensive, but I definitely think it's worth it. And there are some scholarships available if you can't afford that. There's also a lot of online resources for learning debate. There's several YouTube channels like this one, and I know more policy specific ones too, if you're more so on the LD or the policy side of things. And using YouTube to also watch rounds can be very helpful. I think I learned a lot just from watching college policy rounds over and over again and flowing them.
Do you have any actual like recommendations of channels that you like?
Yeah, so I watched almost all of Bill Batterman's videos.
Oh,
He coaches high school policy. And then I also watched the DDI videos, which
mhm.
is Dartmouth Debate Institute. There are a few other policy ones out there that I'm forgetting, but if I give you a list of those, you can always put them in the
Yeah,
description box.
I'll add
It's
those.
been a while.
And then you also mentioned, I actually, this sort of displays, I think, my ignorance a little bit. I feel like I came from a very privileged team that had a lot of like history and did everything for me. I didn't even know you could like reach out to tournament directors for fee waivers.
Yeah.
What is the process like? Do you just like go on Tab Room and find the email and just like, hey, can I? I have a discount.
Yeah, basically, that's what I did for all of the college policy tournaments that I attended my first couple of years. Usually, we also had to reach out to them to ask if it was okay for us to be a hybrid entry,
Mm,
especially if I wasn't competing with someone who was also from another established team. So we'd reach out to them, ask if it's okay for us to compete, and then ask for a fee waiver. And usually, they would just approve it straight through tap room. So the process is super easy.
nice. That's awesome. Yeah, definitely good to know for people who I'm sure are facing similar barriers and want to
Yeah.
participate a lot. Okay, so now some more questions about like the debates themselves. First one is just how did you learn policy debate? Like you came from a different background. You went to a camp maybe, but it was an LD camp, and then you had like no team behind you in policy. So how did you learn it?
Okay, so I think I just learned Circuit LD first, and then that led me to learn more about policy arguments through that, that then led into me doing college policy. And Circuit LD, I learned through camp, like I said, also watching a lot of videos online, watching some rounds in person, because, like I said, I did attend two tournaments that were
Mhm.
both in Massachusetts my senior year. And then during COVID, I was attending tournaments all of the time on Discord and just learning from that. But it's funny because when I started college policy debate, I thought it would be a lot more like LD than it was. And so I went in and I was extending these silly theory arguments that people read in LD in the 2NR and the 2AR every single round. And the first couple tournaments I went to weren't that competitive. So that strategy actually did end up being quite successful. But I soon learned that if you want to be better at the upper levels, you can't keep doing that. And so I think that's when I dove straight into policy research. And I did have a lot of help here and there because, like I said, I would hybrid with different teams, usually learn quite a lot from their coaches beforehand when we did practice rounds to prepare us for the tournament. And I got a lot of insight into how different teams prepare for tournaments.
Yeah, I feel like high reading is such an interesting thing. I feel like it's not as much of a thing in high school, I guess, because some tournaments are picky about like
Yeah.
if you're from the same school. But I actually have coached some students who hybrided at almost every tournament they went to, and were able to do that with relatively little controversy. So
Yeah.
I think it's possible if you don't have any other partners or like people who are really invested in debate at your school, you can still do a partner event like policy or public forum. And the other thing you mentioned is like policy was way different from LD,
Yeah.
but you still were able to get by the first few tournaments with some similar strategies. I had a similar experience in APTA actually. We won, like I was with this other PFer. We won the novice tournament running like extinction scenarios every round, which is not a great strategy
Yeah.
long term in APTA. But I was getting me thinking, like, what do you think are the biggest differences between really good policy and the LD that you were used to?
Hmm. I think people in policy are a lot less tolerant of some of the arguments that are very prevalent in LD. Like I mentioned silly theory arguments. I'm now more on the policy side of those, where I don't understand how people can take them so seriously in LD when they're such bad arguments. Although I do think that the reason I think they're bad arguments might be different from the reason most policy people think they're bad. So while we do agree on the end result of that, our reasonings tend to be different. There's also philosophy arguments in LD, which doesn't exist in policy. Something else, which I think could be cool in policy as well. I think people should introduce them. That was actually true at the last NDT where we saw some Kant in policy. But for the most part, it's not become a meta or anything. And I think another big difference too is just the amount of evidence that you need for policy. Like in LD, you don't need any evidence past the 1NC for the neg. Like sometimes people read evidence in the 2NR, but that's not that common. But then the research burden in policy is just not even comparable to that. You have a 15-minute block in the middle of the round where you have to introduce new evidence for the neg. So you have to have everything just blocked out and have cards after cards after card. Each policy file is so long. And so just getting used to that was kind of the adjustment because I do remember that in my first few policy debates, I was barely reading evidence in the block and then realizing, wait, the 2NC is a constructive speech and the 1NR might not be a constructive, but it's treated like that. And so you just want to read as much evidence as possible. And that's the role of those speeches to be able to outcard the app like five
That
to
makes
one.
sense. It's definitely different from a lot of the debate that I'm used
Yeah.
to. Okay, I have a few questions about policy. I think partly for myself and partly for I think a lot of my viewers who don't know anything about policy. So I want to start with that, and then I'll ask you more about like your opinions about debate and hot takes and
Yeah.
things. So first, some questions about policy that might be relevant to PF. What is a K?
That's a great question. And I still don't think I have a good answer for myself because there doesn't seem to be one agreed upon definition of a K. I think in general, Ks seem to have two components that I hear people talk about. One is that they draw on critical theory, which is a school of philosophical thought that focuses on analyzing power relations in the world. It's quite broad in terms of the authors that people draw from, though. And second is that K arguments tend to either not affirm the resolution on the app or not disprove the consequences of the plan or disprove that the plan is a good idea on the neg. And so usually they'll talk about something else that isn't directly related to the topic at hand.
Right. Maybe this will kind of blend some of the questions together because I know maybe you'll get to this when I ask you about your opinions about debate. But what do you think, in your opinion, is the best way to handle Ks? Because I know one of the ways that you found a lot of success in policy was just practicing responding to Ks over and over again and doing that very well. So what, in your opinion, is the best strategy to beat Ks?
So both on the app and the neg, I think you should be going for framework, which shouldn't be that much of a surprise coming from me. I don't think that this is something that many people would disagree upon on the neg. I think most people agree that against K apps, you want to go for framework because they're usually not talking about the topic. Even if they're somewhat related to the topic, a lot of your generic disads just won't apply. And so you don't have something to read against them except for Ks. And those can be kind of tricky because if the app can define their advocacy however they want and not be tied to the resolution, it becomes a lot easier for them to skirt links that you'll make. And so they'll just redefine their advocacy in the 2AC, keep it intentionally vague in the 1AC so they can do that. So I think that's why you even see a lot of K teams going for framework on the neg against other K teams. But I think that people don't really think about that so much on the app. And I think they should, because I don't think that there is that much of a structural difference between app Ks and neg Ks. Like neg Ks will sometimes act like they're talking more about the app, but their link arguments wouldn't be about the topic. If they disprove the plan, then they would be disads, not Ks.
Right.
The reason they're Ks is because they're finding something small in the app to critique that does not relate to the overall app advocacy and then using it to talk about whatever they want. And so I think the app's best strategy in that case is also framework. Apps will always make some sort of framework argument, but usually they're not getting as much out of it as I think they could be. Usually apps will go for the argument, let us weigh the case, which doesn't make that much sense because how do you weigh the consequences of doing some hypothetical policy against like the in-round rhetoric that you're saying? Those are two things that operate on different levels. And so it doesn't make sense to compare them like that. And I think usually that will lead to the judge looking both at the consequence of the plan and then the consequence of the links and just being kind of confused.
Yeah.
And so I think the best strategy, and you're making the same framework arguments for that kind of framework interp as you would be for a more restrictive framework interp that tries to take away all of the negs offense by being like debate should only be about the truth or falsity of the resolution. And so why not use those arguments for something that you can get more out of, And then I think all you would have to do is spend the entire 6 minutes of the 2AR or 3 minutes of your NLD just focusing on framework, and you can win the round that way.
Okay, I have two questions about that. One is like taking a step back, very basic. You've already hinted at it, but like, what is framework?
Yeah, so framework is an argument about how the judge should evaluate the debate, like what should be in their consideration. So in the case of Ks, framework for the policy team that's responding to the K would be the judge should only focus on, or like the judge should focus on the consequences of doing the app or on the reasons the app would be bad. Whereas, so like the resolution should kind of structure the arguments that the judge evaluates, whereas K framework might be more like the judge should focus more on the ideological underpinnings in terms of evaluating whose worldview is better rather than on whether the resolution is true or false.
So it sounds like a lot of like questions about what the role of the judge might be in the debate. That makes sense. And then the second question that I had is, how can you make your framework arguments better? Because I know like a lot of teams run the same kind of old generic like topicality arguments. I've heard like actually this is another question I have. What the heck is the difference between framework and T framework? Does this just mean T framework is a part like a version of framework or falls into the category of a framework argument?
I mean, T framework is when you read framework against the K on the neg. I've heard people draw some more distinctions between T and framework, where they're like, my argument is T, it's not framework, therefore it's not excluding it's not exclusionary the way framework might be. I don't fully understand the difference
Yeah,
between
neither
those
do
two
I.
things. I kind of use the words T framework and framework interchangeably, except for the fact that framework can also apply to app framework.
Right,
And then in that case, it wouldn't be topicality because you're the
right.
app.
Okay, that makes complete sense. And then the question I was asking is like, how can you go beyond just the boring framework answers that are recycled over and over again to get like better framework debates?
Yeah, I don't think that those answers tend to be that bad. I mean, it depends on which answers you're referring to. I think fairness is the best impact. I think in general, education is not an impact in theory debates, which might be one of my hot takes that we can also put as one of the answers of that question that you're later going to ask. But I think that not only does education not kind of take the best, it's not the best offense, but
Mhm.
in terms of like what the true arguments are. Other than just being another impact to fairness, right? If the round is unfair, then it's also uneducational because you can't get as much class if you can't prepare, right? Like, other than that, I think if you focus on education, as in policy education is good, then you're kind of saying that the K's education doesn't matter as much. Like, whatever they're talking about is not educational,
Right.
which I think tends to be a weaker argument in the sense that they want to say, you want to shut down the conversations that we want to have. And you're going to say, well, it's just unfair. It's not about the content of your
Yeah.
conversations in the sense that like this is a specific topic that we shouldn't talk about or that's uneducational, but rather the fact that your arguments do not prove the truth or falsity of the resolution means we could not be prepared to debate them. Therefore, they're just not apt for this debate topic, even though if we wrote a completely different debate topic, then maybe your arguments would be applicable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess thinking about it more, it like does seem like kind of a difficult position to take to say like all of the things you're critiquing just don't matter.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
who cares about your yapping?
Yeah.
Um,
I do think that the best way to articulate the fairness argument, though, is just saying that maybe it would be good to discuss your topic in a vacuum, but
mhm.
that's not what the resolution was about. The resolution was about this one thing. That's the one thing that we both had before the round because we had the topic. We both prepared to debate that. So you switching the debate to anything else you want to talk about is unfair to us because we could do months and months of prep on that and we just couldn't. And I think even that's even true, even if the AF or the NAG, whatever the K team is in this sense, draws some tenuous connection to the topic, because it's like just because there's some connection doesn't mean that you are affirming or negating the topic, right? It's like you can always talk about the topic in a way that's favorable to you, right? As soon as you justify moving a little bit away from the topic, becomes kind of arbitrary. Like, what's the difference between moving away a little bit versus talking about something completely different, right? So the only non-arbitrary point is to hold ourselves to the wording of the topic itself.
That makes sense. So let me know if I have this right. I'm going
Yeah.
to try to summarize some of these conclusions. Your argument is that the most important thing when it comes to these debates about framework is fairness,
Yeah.
and that the most important way to get to fairness, maybe the most important internal link to fairness, is like the
Yeah.
predictability that stems from the resolution. That's the one stasis point we both had going into the round. Anything else is sort of arbitrarily just like deciding on you randomly like poof into existence new ground.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, the next thing that I want to ask you about is maybe some advice that you can give our viewers. A lot of them, I think, are coming from PF backgrounds. So there's like a few questions within this, like just generically, how can you get better at debate? What specifically can PFers do to learn from LD and policy, and things like that?
Yeah, so generically, there's a couple of things that come to mind. First is just how important warrant depth is.
Mhm.
It's not something that I thought about that much as a debater. I was known for being quite flippy, but now as a
Same.
judge, when I listen to so many rounds, I'm just trying to be able to vote on arguments, but I don't know if I have enough of a warrant for them. And I think this applies to PF for sure, because PFers are known for being notoriously bad with warranting their arguments. But I would much prefer a debater to choose one or two arguments that they think are the winning arguments in the round and then thoroughly explain them to me and how they interact with the arguments from the other side than for debaters to go for a million different arguments and not explain any of them, because I often feel like I just can't vote on so many arguments that haven't been sufficiently explained. So always just fully explain your evidence, like your logical warrants for each argument. Don't assume that the judge is just going to fill that in for you. So that's one piece of advice. Second piece of advice is that I think debaters can think more about how different arguments interact with each other. One of the mistakes that I see, even in some advanced rounds, is that debaters will add in arguments that actively contradict each other, and then justify it being like, they're conditional. But you should think about how the truth claims that you make in a 1NC, for example, are not conditional in the sense that the app can concede one statement you make about the world and then use it to take out another one of the arguments you've made. And I think that that's something that debaters on the other side can also be taking advantage of more, because I often see you've read like a pro-market counterplan and a cap K at the same time. It's like, okay, maybe you want to concede that the logic in the card of the pro-market counterplan is correct, use that to impact her in the cap K, then you have to do a lot less work on the cap K, and then maybe you want to go for another strategy against the pro-market counterplan, like competition or whatever. But think about how the arguments interact with each other, both when you're constructing your strategies and when you're responding to them.
That makes a ton of sense. Okay, the next thing that I'll ask you about, this should be like the bulk of our conversation.
Okay.
What are your biggest debate hot takes? Let's talk.
Oh, okay. So I think they can be split up into two main ideas. One is that I think that debate should reflect the real world a lot more, in the sense that if something is not logical in the real world, it also shouldn't be logical in debate. A lot of people think that debate exists in some strange realm where it's utterly disconnected from any argument that you would make outside of it. And that's just not how it works. Like debate is inseparable from the logic that we would use just talking about arguments in general with our friends and our family. It doesn't make sense to think about it as so separate. I think that there's a few implications for this. One of them is, let me think. Okay, one of them is theory arguments. So
Right.
I think non-resolutional theory just doesn't make sense as a concept to me, because when you
Real
want to
quick,
define
yeah.
non-resolutional theory, yeah.
What is non-resolutional
Okay,
theory?
so non-resolutional theory is theory that is not related to the resolution. So basically any theory other than topicality. So for example, the arguments that conditionality might be bad, maybe more frivolous arguments like font size theory or trigger warning theory, which I know a lot of PFers seem to love. Yeah, I don't think that makes sense, because in the real world, we don't make up laws after people break them, right? You don't do something and then other people say, wait, it should be a law that you shouldn't have done something, and then try to convict you on that. That wouldn't make sense, because you didn't know that you were doing anything wrong ahead of time, right? It would just be illogical to say that you did something wrong when you had absolutely no knowledge that you were supposed to be doing anything different. And so I think that same logic should apply to debate. I think another example, less in terms of the structure of arguments, but more in terms of the content. This one is very applicable to policy debate, but people seem to love extinction impacts, even on topics where they don't make sense at all. This isn't to say that you should never read an extinction impact just because it's an extinction impact. Like if you're talking about nuclear weapon policy, obviously read an extinction impact. But if you're talking about a domestic policy like living wage, maybe it doesn't make much sense to go for an extinction impact. And I think it's a little strange to think that the only impacts that matter are extinction ones. Like obviously more soft left impacts would matter too, and not necessarily because we should be evaluating everything through a different framework. Like I think I'm partial to the view that utilitarianism is probably correct, although that's obviously contestable. But I think there are ways that you can make those kinds of arguments matter under util that people aren't taking advantage of because they just instinctively run to these less plausible arguments.
That makes sense. So just to recap, the first implication here is about non-resolutional theory.
Yeah.
So your stance is that basically any argument, be it a theory shell, non-resolutional theory, or like a K or something like that, any argument that does not directly tie back to the topic, like affirm the resolution or negate the resolution, is something that like doesn't really belong in the debate or should not be evaluated as a reason to vote A for neg. Okay, that makes sense. So I guess like just to play devil's advocate for a bit, maybe some of the arguments that people would use against this is like how do you account for potential like actual abuses that might happen in the round? I'm trying to imagine examples, but I'm trying to like the most extreme examples would be clipping, for instance, is a big thing, right? This is when someone is spreading through cards and they're going too fast for people to really make sure that they're saying every word, and they deliberately skip past some of the highlighted words in the cards, and they kind of lie about how many of the words they actually said. And so they like artificially add content to their speech that wasn't actually said.
Yeah. So two arguments against that. One is I think that that is something that could be included in a tournament invitation ahead of time, just like I think the resolution is included in the tournament invitation. So that constitutes part of the rules. I think you can also make other rules. For example, you can say we're mandating open source disclosure at this tournament. Like some tournaments have already done that, or we're like
Really?
banning clipping. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Wait, like policy tournaments.
I'm thinking LD tournaments.
Oh,
It
actually,
probably applies to policy tournaments as well, but I don't know that much about policy on the high school level. But then you can just refer to the rules and say there actually has been a rule violation because you should have known this ahead of time. But second, I think that if a debater has just not read a complete piece of evidence in the round, then the judge shouldn't consider it at all. Like if somebody just didn't make an argument, and I heard that as a judge that they're trying to make up an argument that wasn't in their prior speech, then I wouldn't even think about the argument, right? And so I don't think clipping would be that big of a deal in the sense that I just wouldn't be considering the argument.
That makes sense. I guess I feel like the reason that people read theory against clipping is because you might not know as a judge which things were clipped or not. So, for example, right? Like presumably if you catch clipping, it's very difficult to catch. And so if you catch one instance of clipping, maybe it's likely that there are like 20 more that you didn't catch. And so what are you like what do you do with that if that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think if that happened and I already knew that a debater was clipping part of the speech and I couldn't be 100% sure that they hadn't done that in the rest of the speech, I think that would be grounds to drop them because if they're making up an entire speech that they haven't read, then I can't evaluate any of those arguments. Like, I don't think that it would be bad for me as a judge to drop them. I think kind of adding on to the tournament invitation idea, a lot of judges do put in their paradigms, if I catch you clipping, I will like report you to that, or I will like instantly drop you, right? And I think that's also a way to check back against it because then it's like the rule did exist ahead of time, but it was just in the judge's paradigm, which I don't know if we want to put judges' paradigms as like a rule book, but I think that it would possibly make sense for it to be like that.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, I feel like that is maybe also a controversial issue. Is some people like, don't like judges pretending to be these like police of debate, like just enforcing all of the norms that they agree with. But it is one way that you can rectify maybe some of the holes in the tournament invitation or the NSDA rulebook. When it comes to like egregious violations, obviously. At the end of the day, like the decision in the debate is always up to the judge.
Right.
And so they are kind of the rule book in a sense
in
any given round. But the degree to which they should use that jurisdiction maybe varies depending on people's opinions.
As a judge, I would also not be opposed to, like, if the other debater caught the clipping and I didn't, I wouldn't be opposed to them stopping the round and being like, I caught that clipping, I have a recording of it. Like, can we end the round here, right? Like, I don't think it would be productive for that to even become an argument in the debate round itself. And so why should that be part of me evaluating the round if I've decided, okay, like one debater is making this allegation, I'm just going to stop this round and decide it myself.
That makes sense. I have always kind of wondered, like, it seems like some violations of theory shells are egregious enough that it makes more sense to just like tell the judge that this happened and be like, can we just like decide right now if we're going to continue the round instead of like debating it out.
Right. I think another example that sometimes people will bring up is what if a debater says a racial slur? Like, shouldn't that be an argument I can make in the round? And I'm like, no, if a debater is doing that, then I would probably stop the round and tell tab. I don't think that's an issue that should even be debated out in the first place, because then the better debater wins the round. And that might be the one who said a racial slur. Like, if I think it's so egregious that that's a reason the other debater should lose, that we should completely suspend this game and not talk about the truth or falsity of the resolution anymore, then yeah, I would contact tab and end the round. Like,
that makes sense. So I guess an important distinction then for your position is you're not saying debaters should not say that a bad thing has happened. You're saying that they shouldn't like make a theory argument and then proceed to debate the theory, like debate whether or not the thing is bad enough to
yeah.
but for example, like if a debater caught someone like clipping, or even if it's something less egregious, like something more, I don't know, controversial, like, hey, by the way, they paraphrase all of their evidence. I just don't know if you care about that, but thought you should know, just in case you didn't catch that. I think you should drop them. But then like continue. And then that's not like an issue that's debated. It's just like up to the judge.
Yeah. Yeah, that
Okay,
makes sense.
that makes sense. Um, and the reason for all of this all comes back to fairness, I guess.
Yeah, predictability, but predictability is an internal link to fairness.
Right. And so by predictability in this case, you mean like these other arguments are unpredictable, like the laws thing, right? Like
Yeah.
they didn't know it was a law beforehand, so they shouldn't be held accountable for it
Yeah.
necessarily.
And
Okay.
I think some people will answer this by saying, okay, well, it should be predictable that maybe you shouldn't read 20 conditional counterplans in your speech. Like obviously somebody's going to read condo against you, right? But I still think that then it becomes, first of all, I think that what's predictable is kind of dependent on the person and the judge. And so I don't think we can say this is predictable versus this is not in an arbitrary way. We have to draw the line somewhere. And the only place where it makes sense to do that is the text of the resolution, because that's the one thing that we both had going into the round. Otherwise, we can keep bending the rules a little more and being like, no, this should have been predictable. So yeah, I think that's just the only thing that makes sense.
That makes sense. Okay, last question about debate, and then we'll talk about the PF topic. What makes debate meaningful for you?
Oh, this is a good question. I think one of so like obviously everybody just says critical thinking, but to explain that a little bit more, I think debate is unique because it forces you to look at both sides of the topic. And for example, maybe you'll find a study for one side of the topic, but then since you also have to be neg on that topic, you're like, I'm going to find a way to refute that study. And so then you find a counter study that answers that. And then you go back to the original off side and you're like, how can I defend my study against the response to that? And you keep going back and forth, which forces you to kind of look at those next level responses in a way that you wouldn't in any other activity. Just because here it's like you are going to have to be both sides. You're motivated by the idea of like competitive gain, right?
Mhm.
And so it's just a very exciting way to kind of just go really in depth in a topic in a way that you wouldn't if you were simply writing a research paper on one side of a topic and maybe answering arguments once. And something else is that I think I mentioned this in another one of our workshops, but I think I did have some like pretty strong intuitions about what I believe politically before I came into debate.
Mhm.
One example I think is like single payer healthcare. I was like, okay, I think it's probably good for everybody to have access to healthcare
Right.
regardless of their ability to pay. But then when I went into debate, I could fully analyze that issue by going into both sides of it and being like, okay, now I'm able to explain why I think all the neg arguments are wrong because I once had to defend those arguments. And by defending those arguments, you know all of the weak points in them in a way that you couldn't if you were just on one side the entire time. And so I think, if anything, it kind of reinforced my own convictions by forcing me to take the other side seriously, which I think is super valuable.
Yeah, 100%. I totally have experienced that in my own debating as well. Like I've said before, I think I've told you before, I feel like I have learned more things from debate than I've learned from like any other source, like
Yeah.
education in general. And a lot of those are like strengthening my convictions
Yeah.
or understanding how to argue both sides of an issue. I think it's like maybe the way I would put it is more than any other educational activity, I feel like debate gives you a reason to learn more
Right.
and like solidify and deepen your understanding of issues, even the ones you think you already understand.
Yeah, and on what you said about how you've learned more from debate than you have from school or any other educational activity, I 100% agree with that. I feel like topics that I've had to debate come up in everyday life, like all the time. Like just a few hours ago, for example, I was talking to my friend. He mentioned something about open borders being a bad idea. And I was like, oh my God, my open borders app is coming back. And so we ended up having an entire debate about that. And I felt like I was so well informed on the topic because I had to cut an entire app and also responses to all of the that. So it just keeps coming up every day, both in terms of the content, but also in terms of the skills you learn of like
Yeah.
listening to somebody else's arguments and knowing different strategies that you can use to respond to them.
Damn, bro wasn't ready to prep out. Okay, I have one last question actually. Uh, and let me know if you want to talk about this or not, but
Okay.
why did you quit debate? I mean, I just think this might be like useful to talk about for other people who might like
Yeah.
when should people quit? You know, like it is a conversation that should be had.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was kind of complicated,
Hmm.
but for the most part, I had lost a lot of my passion for debate by that point. I think there were several factors contributing to that. One is that I feel like I learned almost everything that I could have from debate, not necessarily in a content perspective, like content wise, I think it's inexhaustible. You can do more and more research on so
Right.
many different debate topics. But I think what always interested me more about debate than the content was kind of how I viewed debate as like a chessboard, almost like logical puzzle pieces that you can put together. And I had come up with like what I think is a pretty solid way of thinking about debate and how
Mhm.
debate operates. And I just felt like I didn't have that much more thinking to do about it. And so it became less interesting to me. Like I feel like I'd kind of figured out debate. And I couldn't have gained that much more by continuing to stay in it. I think another reason is that I was kind of plateauing in terms of my competitive success.
Mhm.
And competition was always one of the most fundamental drivers for me staying in the activity, as I think it is for most people. But I love the feeling of winning rounds. And I think that's the main reason I debated. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that either. But I just felt like I wasn't improving as quickly as I wanted to be. And
Mhm.
so at that point, if I wanted to keep up where I was, I would have had to put in so many hours a week into it while not getting that much more out of it. And it was going to trade off with other activities that I could have done in my life. So I just didn't think it was worth it to stay anymore. But I think that point comes at different points for different people.
Yeah.
I do understand though how after high school, a lot of people do want to quit because they felt like they've dedicated 4 entire years of their life to debate. For me, it was kind of like junior year of high school to junior year of college. So I think it was that same 4 year arc, but maybe a little bit later than most people.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like it's an important like perspective to have, especially here, because like a lot of the people that I'm interviewing and myself included are like this weird subset of people who like completely have sold their souls to the activity.
Yeah.
And like I would maybe also include you that in that. Like I mean, hey, you're in like another country teaching debate right now. You're not completely out of it.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to also know like it's okay not to do debate like with 100% of your energy and time all the time.
Yeah.
Like you should have other interests and you should be a human being outside of debate. And like it's okay to do much less debate after a while if you're just not
Right.
as interested in
And
it.
I do think that the healthiest way to approach debate is not have debate be your entire world, but also have other things and people that you can resort to outside of just that small debate bubble. Because if that's the one thing that you care a lot about, when it doesn't go well in your life, then you're going to feel absolutely
Yeah.
devastated. But if you have many different hobbies, it's like debate isn't going well, you can fall back on something else as well. And I think that debate
Mhm.
also means different things to different people. For some people, debate is maybe less about the competition and more about the friends that they meet in the activity or just enjoying prepping every so often and going to tournaments. You know, you don't have to take it that seriously. You can do however much debate you think is good for you. And I think that there's some benefit to be derived from it, regardless of how much time you put into it.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, thank you for answering all my
Yeah.
debate questions. Now I want to talk about the thing you've all been waiting for, the nuclear energy topic. And Amadea, I think you are uniquely poised to answer some of my questions on this topic because you've been teaching this topic to your students here in
Yeah.
Taiwan for like the past 6 months or so.
And we also had a demo debate on
Yeah.
the topic.
Um, and so I have a few questions for you. I want you to use maybe like put on your policy hat and tell us how you would analyze this if it were like you debating a tournament a few years ago or something.
Yeah.
So first question, the topic is, resolved the United States federal government should significantly or substantially increase investment into domestic nuclear energy. What are your like first thoughts if you're going into prepping this topic for the first time?
Okay, so I think most people are going to start off by being like, let's find reasons nuclear energy is good versus nuclear energy is bad. I think I would look at the entire resolution and first do some research into exactly what the bounds of that are. So one word that catches my attention is investment, right? Like what does investment into nuclear energy mean? Like what is the definition of the term investment? What does it mean when the federal government
Right.
invests money into certain projects? Would that be like public sector? Would that be private sector? Would that be expanding existing projects? Or would that be maybe starting new ones, right? What kind of nuclear energy? I would start to think about all of those questions, both in a policy sense to think about the number of potential apps available and the different categories that I might be able to sort them into. But maybe even in a PF perspective where there are no plans to just think about what some potential app arguments could be. Like maybe there's more creative arguments outside of the generic nuclear energy good arguments that you think everyone's going to make.
So how this is a question that both will ask you about this topic and also maybe some extra information about like how you view debate. But how would you construct like an AF, for example, on this topic?
Yeah, so the entire wording is resolved, United States federal government should increase investment.
Yeah, substantially increase investment, domestic nuclear
Domestic nuclear energy.
energy.
Okay. um, Let me think. I would first do that research, like I was talking about in the last
Right.
question. Then I would try to think about whether there's any benefit in specifying for any part of the resolution, like specifying a method of investment or a form of nuclear energy. In general, I kind of err away from specification just because I think the more specific you get, the more counterplan ground you open up for the neg, right? Because if you specify one kind of nuclear energy, they can be like, okay, let's counterplan and like do another form of nuclear energy, right? And so I think in general, want to keep it more towards the vague side unless I see that there's a significant advantage to one portion of the topic. Um, and then I do think that the arguments I was talking about before, like the generic arguments why nuclear energy is good, are usually the arguments that you do want to include in the AF because those tend to be the core arguments that are talked about in the literature for a reason, right? So even though maybe there's a more creative angle that you can approach a topic in from a solvency kind of lens, right? Like maybe there's a specific investment mechanism that would be uniquely good at solving the econ issue. I think in general, you want those advantages to be the generic advantages because they're generic for a reason, because they're the best ones, right? And so I think that this is kind of how like the advantages that I included in the app that I used to debate you, but I included an econ and a climate advantage. I think that based on reading the literature, those seem to be the strongest arguments for nuclear energy being good.
And how do you like structure the AF with those advantages inside of it? Like what
what would
questions
this
are you answering?
oh like what would the structure of an advantage
Yeah.
would be?
Yeah. The structure of any advantage and then like specifically applied to these ones.
Yeah, so structure of any advantage that I teach my students is harms, impact, solvency, right? Like what are the issues in the world that you're trying to solve? Why do those issues matter? And then how does the plan solve them? Some people like putting a separate solvency section at the bottom. I don't like that so much because I think that makes solvency less contextual to each advantage. And you want to be explaining solvency in the context of how does it solve the specific econ issue, right? Otherwise, people might group cards at the end that are like, here, reasons investment in nuclear energy might be good in the abstract, but they don't directly answer the questions of the advantages. So I guess taking the econ advantage as an example, maybe you want your harms evidence to be something along the lines of right now we're running out of fossil fuels. It's becoming harder and harder to extract them. So even though we're pouring in all this upfront money into fossil fuels, there's going to be this bubble that's going to explode soon because we're not gaining enough money from the fossil fuels. Too expensive to extract them, and soon we'll run out altogether, right? So there's going to be some kind of economic crisis. Then I want some kind of impact evidence, right? Why does that economic crisis matter? And then I want the solvency evidence, which is we can switch to nuclear energy. Like nuclear energy might not be a renewable resource, but we have enough uranium. We can recycle uranium in the sense that we can keep nuclear energy along for a long time, and it can be a stable and reliable form of energy that solves this shortage problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking about this like whole harms, impact, solvency format, and I'm realizing like it seems like it's very similar to the format we would use in PF, which I think is just the DA format that you have in policy, like uniqueness, link, maybe internal link, impact.
Yeah.
And so we would just say like the harms maybe is like the uniqueness on the app,
Yeah.
the impact is the impact, and the solvency is like the link, like what changes in the resolution.
Oh, I mean, I see the parallels between them as being a little different. I think
Okay.
uniqueness and solvency might be more similar because uniqueness for the neg is how is the status quo solving the issue right now? Whereas
Mhm.
solvency for the app is how does the plan solve this issue, right?
Right.
And then I think link and harms are probably similar because link is just like, here's the problem that the app causes. And then the harms like, here's the problem that's existing. And then
Yeah,
the
that's
impact would be the
interesting.
same for both sides.
That's super interesting. So you're kind of grouping them almost more by like the effect they
Yeah.
have vis-a-vis the problem. And I'm grouping them more by like, is it like describing the status quo or is it describing the app world?
Yeah.
I think that the way that I'm describing it is how most PFers have learned it. I'm like wondering why that's the case. Like maybe the reason why we've sort of just stolen the DA structure and applied it to the advantage structure
Yeah.
as well is because in PF there's more of like a symmetry between the AF and the neg. You know, neg can speak first and whatnot. So they're not so different as they are in policy. But maybe it's just like
Yeah.
maybe I'm off base and it's completely arbitrary. But it's interesting to see how we've sort of these concepts have evolved as they've been applied to
Yeah.
PF.
It does annoy me a little bit when PFers talk about there being links on the app because I'm like, what are you talking about? I feel like the link is just here's the problem that the app causes. Like maybe they're talking about internal links, in which, like, yes, that makes sense because every argument is going to have multiple internal links. But when they talk about the link specifically, I think I tend to get a bit confused. I don't think the fact that the neg can speak first in PF should change that though, because I
Mhm.
think the app is still proving, okay, here's a change we should make from the status quo. The neg is proving we should not make that change,
Right,
right? And so I think that the burdens are kind of the same,
right.
regardless of whether one side speaks first or the other side does.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay,
I
so
mean, I guess there are some PF resolutions that aren't phrased as a policy at all, though,
yeah,
and those are completely different. So obviously that doesn't apply for those. I think we're mainly talking about
yeah.
the ones
But
that use normative statements like
honestly,
that.
like the uniqueness link impact also doesn't really apply for those
Yeah,
either.
yeah.
Like I remember we had a topic about is like social media good for democracy or something. And the uniqueness that PFers were used to is just like uniqueness means whatever is happening in the status quo.
Yeah.
But like it didn't function as uniqueness if your topic is about something that's like supporting something that is currently existing in the status quo.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a
Yeah,
weird
and
thing.
I'm also not opposed to resolutions that would defend the
Mhm.
status quo, right? Like, I think inherency is one of those strange norms that we've developed, but
Really quick,
yeah.
what is inherency?
Oh,
For the
yeah,
people
yeah,
at home, you
yeah.
know?
Inherency is the idea that the app has to be some sort of change from what's happening right now, from the status quo. And so the app cannot exist right now, right? And so if the neg reads a piece of evidence that it's just like, hey, your app was passed 2 days ago, then the app wouldn't be inherent anymore. I don't think there's anything wrong with non-inherent apps. I think it's one of those strange norms that we just assume should be in place in policy just because it's how a lot of resolutions function, right? Like you're talking about a policy change for the future. But I would be totally okay with a topic that's like, we shouldn't have passed X policy in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
past.
yeah.
Like, I don't think that's a problem.
This is so crazy because there's actually like a very similar, like eerily similar idea in APTA debate. I'm wondering now if it like came from policy debate in some way through some cross-pollination, but
Yeah.
it's called like squo calls. It's this theory argument that APTA debaters make against cases. For those of you who don't know, in APTA, the like the AF, we call it the gov, gets to choose like what topic you're debating, similar to a plan in policy, but without a topic that constrains what you can say in the plan. So there's no like topicality arguments. And so one of the arguments people on the neg make is they say like, oh, your argument, your plan, your
Yeah.
case in APTA, it already happened. It's something that exists in the status quo. So that's like a big no-no.
Yeah.
And nowadays people in APTA are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, like does that really matter? Like, who
Yeah.
cares? So it's interesting that these same discussions are being paralleled in like what seem to be, at least on the surface, completely different debate formats.
Right.
But we're talking about the same sort of structural issues about arguments. It's cool that like, I don't know, like arguments are arguments no
Yeah,
matter what
exactly.
format they're in. Logic is logic, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like that maybe is a hint at how much we have to learn from other formats. Like
Yeah, for sure.
maybe aptitude debaters should take a look at the discussions in policy about inherency to find arguments against squirrel calls or something.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so it seems like on the app, on this topic about nuclear energy, you are a fan of the econ advantage and the warming advantage. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because there's like the most literature on these advantages. What about the neg? What's your first instinct?
Yeah, so I think that when you look up reasons why nuclear energy are bad and the neg and the abstract, you find a lot of reasons that maybe don't make great debate arguments. For example, nuclear waste disposal arguments, uranium mining being bad. What are a few other ones? Accidents. Like those are the main three that I'm thinking of right now. I think the reason they don't make good debate arguments is maybe more a fault with debate than it is with actually. I have mixed opinions on this because on one hand, I believe that just because these aren't extinction impacts doesn't mean they don't matter, right? I think that there should still be a way to make these arguments matter in the debate. But also, truthfully, I do think that when you ask people in the real world, a lot of scientists will agree that climate change is a more important concern than some accidents that would not affect that many people if they occurred and are also relatively rare. Not that those accidents don't matter at all, but just in comparison to the app's huge climate impact, it's a little difficult to win that they matter more. And so that's why I think the best neg argument is actually stealing that climate impact and going for the renewables disad, which is that nuclear investment in nuclear energy will trade off with investment in renewables, proven by the fact that in countries where the government has invested more money into nuclear, we see less of a thriving renewables industry, and the renewable energy is better for solving climate change overall. And I think that is kind of a difficult argument for the app to answer. Not impossible for sure. I think there's some arguments why renewables might be bad. The one that comes to mind right now is intermittency, just that renewables only work when the weather is at certain conditions, right? Like solar panels are going to be more effective when it's sunny outside, and windmills are only going to be effective when we don't have certain like weather events that might mess up how they function, right? And I think that that's an argument that the nuclear side could make, just that nuclear energy is much more reliable in that sense. But I do think that there's reasons why renewable energy might be better than nuclear that could be stronger than that as well. I think there's also responses to the intermittency argument. So it's a good debate to be had on both sides, but I do believe that's one of the stronger neg arguments. Another neg argument that I just thought about like 15 minutes ago, or more than 15 minutes now, like when Mac told me that we were doing this interview, is the idea of a counterplan that might compete on investment. Because I Googled the word investment and it seemed to say that it was the act or process of investing in an industry for profit. And that made me think, if the government nationalizes the nuclear energy industry and then like puts money into it, would that count as an investment if the government isn't directly making a profit out of it? I'm not 100% sure, but I do think that there could be an interesting counterplan that's like, we should nationalize the industry and then expand on it. And that could be competitive in the sense that that might not count as an investment, right?
That makes sense. I feel like this is one skill that policy debaters really develop that like PFers and parley debaters don't really pay attention to very much, because in a lot of your resolutions, it matters so much more like the definition of each of the words in the resolution.
Yeah.
And you pay a lot of attention to that. So yeah, I think that produces some really interesting arguments like this one. And I think that maybe there's an argument that like in PF, these two counterplans would be weaker because, well, we don't have counterplans.
Yeah.
I think they're probably still viable. Like you just have to make a uniqueness argument for like a DA that says there's a trade-off, like maybe renewables.
Oh, you mean for the renewables argument?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that you need the counterplan to make the renewables argument. Like I was initially envisioning it as a disad, but also even if you add a renewables argument, you still have to answer the perm argument, which is like, we should do nuclear energy and renewable, and you need to prove why they're incompatible. And that's going to be your link argument. And so it's like, if the disad fails for that reason, the counterplan probably also fails.
Okay, yeah. So I guess they're pretty similar in that regard. That makes sense. Okay, so I have a question about this debate that might happen. We can imagine like a hypothetical debate between you and this like alternate version of you, where you pit your AF idea against your neg idea.
Yeah.
Because I think there's something interesting going on. Your AF has like the econ advantage and the warming advantage. The neg has just basically a warming DA.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of like econ and warming. Only F has econ. Both sides have warming.
I'm actually not sure about that because I think that renewables could also solve the econ problem because the
I
econ
see.
problem is specific to fossil fuels. And so
Right.
all it requires is a shift away from fossil
Oh,
fuels.
wait, yeah, wait, that's true.
Yeah.
So it's just like,
I actually did have this exact debate where I was reading Econ and Climate versus somebody else at camp who was reading the renewables dissent.
oh, crazy. Wait,
Yeah.
what happened in the debate? You gotta tell us.
um, it was pretty close, I think.
Mhm.
I just chose one. I don't think it mattered which advantage I chose at the end because I thought that the renewables counterplan solved both of them
Hmm.
to kind of the same degree. And so I think I can't remember. I think I chose the econ one, and then I just tried to make deficits to the renewables counterplan by being like, here's a bunch of reasons why renewable fails. And then it just came down to an evidence comparison debate of who had better evidence for renewables versus nuclear energy better at solving these problems.
What are like good reasons why renewables fail?
The intermittency problem is
Mhm.
big.
Right.
That's the first one I mentioned. Then there's other issues with gaining access to renewables, like the minerals that we need, both
Oh,
in
right.
terms of that being like a huge investment in like or like both being like a climate issue, right? Because it's like we need to extract these minerals, but also raising some security concerns
Mhm.
if we go into portions of Africa, for example, that China has already staken claims in, and that could cause a conflict if we're trying to get those minerals.
Okay, right. We're
Yeah,
getting those big attacks.
yeah. So those are the big two that I remember. I think I'd have to go back and look at the evidence though, because it was a long time ago.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's cool
Yeah.
though. I feel like a renewables cause war scenario
Yeah,
is
I
like,
think, okay, there were also some good arguments about renewables that were just like, that were also, I think the best arguments about renewables being bad were just like renewables would require overall more like resource input
mhm.
because we would produce more and more efficiently. But it was kind of like Javon's paradox, where it's like,
No, I'm not familiar.
so it's the idea that the more you produce, the more it actually or like the more efficient you make things, the more you actually produce. And so you end up increasing emissions in the long run because
Oh,
people then have this like kind of insatiable urge to like consume more and more,
right.
which is
Okay.
also an issue that could be applied to nuclear energy as well. And so it was more of a DDEV argument that I felt like I couldn't go for it just because I was also arguing for nuclear energy as
Right.
a potential solution to climate problems, whereas those who would agree with Javon's paradox would generally be more on the degrowth side of things, where they believe that there is no way that we can continue growing our economy at the rate that it is, but
Right.
also stick with some clean energy
Yeah.
alternative.
I mean, I feel like at the very least, this is like defense on the warming voting issue. Like, if Javon's paradox is correct, then like the warming advantage doesn't really have solvency.
Yeah, but I mean, I read a warming advantage too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Like, see, it equally applies
I think
elsewhere.
in this round,
Yeah, yeah.
it's not the best as a tiebreaker, but maybe in other rounds, if someone is going for something completely separate, then maybe reading Javon's paradox as an argument could be strategic to take away the warming issue.
Yeah. I mean, now I'm thinking there could be an interesting argument with if the app reads this with econ and warming, there could be an interesting argument if the neg decides to impact turn econ and then say,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
we
yeah.
are running out of
Right.
fossil fuels right now. And then that eliminates the concern with them contributing to warming, but we have a much stronger internal link to warming because we're
Yeah.
turning econ. And
Right,
so the
right.
econ collapse would be good for them.
Yeah,
So I think that could be interesting.
yeah. DDEV into the link turn to warming.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Okay, last few questions about nuclear energy. Which side would you prefer in this debate?
Hmm. I honestly think it's very well balanced. I don't think I would have a strong opinion on which side. In an LD round, I would always say nay because LD speech times are screwed. But in PF, I don't think I would have a strong opinion. I think I would feel happy either affirming or negating.
Mhm. If this were a policy topic, what do you think would be the most common like Ks that are topic specific? I know that most of the Ks wouldn't change. Like, who cares what the topic is?
Yeah.
But probably some of them would have different links at the very least.
Yeah. I think a big one is the cap K for sure, that
Mhm.
this investment in clean tech um is kind of okay. I sort of see the issue with most K-link arguments is I see them as defense. Like, I can't possibly understand how saying that this investment in clean tech is somehow gonna further perpetuate capitalism when there's all of these uniqueness questions like that. I think it's just a solvent, like it's a great solvency argument. I think it's probably a true one too. Like I agree
Mhm.
with a lot of the anti-capitalist literature out there. I just can't conceive of how that's offense for the neg. But yeah, people do read the Gapke on this topic.
Uh, Am I remembering correctly? I think there's a video of you on YouTube, maybe debating nuclear energy against Jacob,
Yeah, yeah.
where
You read the
yeah,
Gapke
yeah, okay.
framework.
So
Yeah.
that's perfect. I mean, I guess I'll link that in the description
Okay.
too. If any viewers want to like really understand what Amadea is talking about with the CapK on the nuclear energy topic, there is a debate that you can go watch between her and one of my friends, Jacob Palmer, who also did a lot of LD in policy.
Yeah.
So go check that out. And yeah, are there any other things that you want to mention before we finish up here?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, well, thank you so much for giving all of your opinions.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This
Yeah,
was really fun.
for sure. And I'm sure you will be back on this channel pretty soon. Remember, go like and subscribe on Amadeus channel as well. And I hope everyone has a good day.
Bye.